Hello and welcome to another episode of Ask the Consistory. I'm your host for this video, Reverend Jake Zabel of the St. John's Evangelical Lutheran Church located in Dalby, Queensland, Australia. Ask the Consistory is a video podcast produced by the Confession Orthodox Evangelical Lutheran Communion where we answer your questions. And today's question is kind of more just, what does the Bible and the Lutheran Church teach about the descent of Christ into hell? Well, let's look at this. I wrote a sermon on this the other year, and I'm going to be basically reading large chunks for my sermon, but essentially beginning with first, the Apostles' Creed says that Christ descended into hell. And this is based on several different scriptures, which we shall get to, such as Psalm 16:10, particularly its quote in Acts 2:27 that talks about Christ not being abandoned in Hades. So the psalm talks about God not abandoning his Holy One to Hades, and St. Peter picks this up in the book of Acts to say this is a reference to Christ. There's also Matthew 12:40 where Jesus talks about how he must be in the same way that Jonah was in the belly of the whale, that he must be in the belly of the earth. And then there is Colossians 2:15, which talks about Christ disarming the evil powers. This is one of the verses that is picked up in the Formula of Concord in the Lutheran Confessions. But the chief verse is always from 1 Peter chapter 3, verses 18 to 22, where it talks about Christ descending to preach to the spirits in prison. So I'd recommend you go look up those verses, and I would recommend you just go read the Formula of Concord, both the Epitome and the Sola Declaration, on what the Lutheran Church says about Christ's ascent into hell. But for today, I'm going to give you kind of a explanation of what exactly the Lutheran confessions teach regarding this. So, regarding the chief controversy of the descent of Christ into hell, the question was whether Christ descended into hell to suffer or whether he descended in triumph. So Calvin taught that Christ's descent into hell was part of his suffering, whereas Luther taught that Jesus descended into hell in part of his triumph to proclaim victory over sin, death, and the devil. And so Luther said in his Torgau sermon, before Christ arose and ascended into heaven, and while yet lying in the grave, he also descended into hell in order to also deliver us from it, who were to be held in it as prisoners. However, I shall not discuss this article in a profound and subtle manner as to how it was done and what it means to descend into hell, but adhere to the simplest meaning conveyed by these words, as we must represent it to children and to uneducated people. Such, therefore, is the plainest manner to speak of this article, that we may adhere to the words and cling to this main point, that for us, through Christ, hell has been torn to pieces and the devil's kingdom and power utterly destroyed, for which purpose he died and was buried and descended, so that it should no longer harm or overwhelm us, as Jesus himself says in Matthew 16:18, where he says, the gates of hell shall not overcome us. So, according to Luther, the purpose of Christ's ascent into hell was to destroy the power of hell. As I said, as you read in Colossians 2, that Jesus, by his death on the cross, has disarmed Satan. And Jesus did not descend into hell as part of his suffering. Instead, Jesus descended into hell to proclaim victory over sin, death, and the devil, and to declare to the wicked spirits, both demon and also to the unbelievers, that they have been defeated and that they are now damned for eternity. See, Christ declared condemnation to all those who were unbelievers, who rejected the Messiah. Now, the text in St. Peter specifically speaks of Jesus speaking to the wicked people of Noah's day. Now, this is not to say that they're the only ones in hell, but that Peter used them as an example, that just as they rejected the ark and were swept away in the flood, so too, anyone who rejects Christ, the ark of God, will be swept away in the coming judgment. And so, Christ descended into hell to declare victory over the devil, to declare that he is defeated and that everyone who believes in Jesus Christ will not end up in hell. But at the same time to declare to Satan, his angels, and to all unbelievers that they are damned for eternity and that there is no salvation for them. The Formula of Concord in Article 9 says that it is enough that we know that Christ descended into hell and destroyed hell for all believers, and that he redeemed from them the power of death, the devil, and the eternal damnation of hellish retribution. And the Sola Declaration also adds, we simply believe that the entire person, God and man, descended into hell after his burial, conquered the devil, destroyed the power of hell, and took from the devil all his power. There is much more I can say, but I mean, I'd just be repeating myself. Essentially, Christ descended into hell and then he rose again. I got some other Luther quotes here where Luther said that in the Torgau sermon that therefore whoever would not go wrong or stumble had best to hear to the words and understand them in a simple way as well he can. Accordingly, it is customary to represent Christ in paintings on wall as he descends, appears before hell, clad in a priestly robe and with a banner in his hand, with which he beats the devil and puts him to flight, takes hell by storm and rescues those that are there. Rescues those that are his. Thus, it was also acted the night before Easter as a play for children, and I am well pleased with the fact that it is painted, played, sung, and said in this manner for the benefit of the simple folk. So, what does it mean when we talk about Christ's descent into hell? It means that Christ descended into hell to declare to the devil that he has been defeated. And as Psalm 16 and Acts 2 says, God did not abandon Christ to hell, Hades, Sheol. But instead, 3 days later, Christ rose from the dead and ascended into heaven for our justification. And so that even though Christ has died, we too shall die. And that Christ descended into hell to declare to the devil that his power has been destroyed, so that we don't have to descend into hell when we die. And that's about it. That's why Christ descended into hell. There is another interesting point about the question of whether Christ descended into hell spiritually or bodily, that is, like physically. And I'd like to discuss that in my next video because this was an interesting controversy in early Lutheranism, and let's discuss that next week. Otherwise, I've been your host, Reverend Jake Zabel. Goodbye, God bless, and if you have any questions, send them to our email address at coelc-atc@hotmail.com.